Envision this. It's 1346. You're standing on the walls of the city of Caffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula, clinging to the edge of the Black Sea. Below you, tens of thousands of Mongol warriors stretch across the steppe as far as you can see. Siege engines, horses, smoke, and somewhere in that camp, a plague is tearing through the Golden Horde faster than any sword ever could. And then the catapults start turning, but they're not loading stone, they're loading the dead. Rotting, plague-infected corpses are being hurled over your walls, one after another. There is nothing you can do about it. What happened at Caffa in 1346 is not just a military story. It's how one siege unleashed the Black Death on all of Europe. How one desperate act of biological warfare set off a chain reaction that killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. How the waiting was just as deadly as the fighting. And how a city no one has heard of today changed human history forever. This is the Battle of Caffa, and it may be the most important siege you've never heard of. To understand Caffa, you need to understand why it existed in the first place. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the most powerful economic engine was the Silk Road. That vast network of overland and maritime trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, spices from India, silk from China, furs from Siberia, gold, slaves, information. All of it flowed through a series of key choke points, and one of the most critical was the Crimean Peninsula. The city of Caffa, known today as Feodosia in modern Ukraine, was founded by the Republic of Genoa in 1266. The Genoese were among the greatest maritime merchants of the medieval world, fierce rivals of Venice. They had secured trading rights from the Mongol rulers of the region. Caffa quickly became one of the wealthiest ports on the entire Black Sea. It was a cosmopolitan, chaotic, brilliant city. Genoese merchants rubbed shoulders with Byzantine Greeks, Armenian traders, Jewish merchants, and Turkic peoples from the steppe. Goods from China arrived here by caravan and were transferred to Genoese ships that would carry them west to Constantinople, and then to Venice, Genoa, and beyond. But Caffa existed entirely at the pleasure of its Mongol neighbors, and that was always a precarious thing. The Golden Horde was the northwestern successor state of the great Mongol Empire founded by Genghis Khan. By 1346, it controlled a massive swath of territory from modern-day Russia to Kazakhstan, stretching from the forests of Siberia down to the Caucasus Mountains. At their peak, they were terrifying, mobile, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. Mongol armies had sacked Baghdad in 1258, snuffing out the Abbasid Caliphate and setting fire to one of the great libraries of the ancient world. They had driven deep into Poland and Hungary. They had fundamentally reshaped the political map of Asia and Eastern Europe. But by the 1340s, the Golden Horde was a different beast. It was still powerful, but increasingly fractured. By internal politics, dynastic rivalries, and the slow erosion that comes with ruling a vast, multi-ethnic empire. The Khan who would lead the siege of Caffa was a man named Jani Beg, who had seized power in 1342 after murdering two of his own brothers. Jani Beg was ambitious, shrewd, and willing to use every tool available to him. He would need all of those qualities for what was coming. The trigger for the siege of Caffa was, as so many medieval conflicts were, a brawl in a marketplace. In 1343, a violent altercation broke out between Italian merchants and local Mongol and Muslim traders in the city of Tana. Accounts differ on exactly what started it: a business dispute, an insult, possibly a killing. What is clear is that the fight turned deadly, and some Muslim traders were killed. The Mongols, under Jani Beg, demanded justice. The Italians fled Tana by ship and took refuge in Caffa. Jani Beg considered this a profound insult. The Genoese were sheltering men he considered criminals under his jurisdiction. He was also, many historians believe, looking for a pretext. Caffa was wealthy. Caffa was strategically vital. And Caffa represented a kind of foreign autonomy within his territory that had always grated. In 1343, Jani Beg's forces besieged Caffa for the first time. The Genoese held out. A Venetian relief fleet arrived and inflicted a significant naval defeat on the Mongols. Jani Beg withdrew, but in 1345 he came back. And this time, everything was different. If this is already blowing your mind, hit that like button and subscribe. We're just getting warmed up, and what comes next is even more insane. Let's talk about what Jani Beg actually brought to the walls of Caffa, because it was considerable. Exact numbers for medieval armies are notoriously unreliable. Chroniclers routinely inflated figures for dramatic effect. However, historians working from multiple contemporary sources estimate that Jani Beg's besieging force likely numbered somewhere between 30,000 and 75,000 men at its height. What we can say with confidence is that the Mongol army was organized around several core elements that had made them the most feared military force in Eurasia for over a century. The backbone was the cavalry, specifically horse archers. Mongol warriors trained from childhood to ride and shoot simultaneously. And they were devastating in open field engagements. The composite Mongol bow could penetrate armor at distances that astounded European opponents. A skilled horse archer could loose up to 10 aimed shots per minute while at a full gallop. These cavalry units were organized into a decimal system, units of 10 called Arban, 100 called Zun, 1,000 called Mingan, and 10,000 called Tumen. Jani Beg likely commanded several Tumen at Caffa, though the dense terrain and the nature of siege warfare meant that the horse archers were not the decisive arm here. That role fell to the siege engineers. The Mongols were extraordinary at siegecraft. They had learned from the best. After conquering China, Central Asia, and Persia, they had absorbed siege engineers, technicians, and scholars from every civilization they defeated. By the mid-14th century, Mongol siege trains included trebuchets capable of hurling massive stones or other projectiles over significant distances, ballistae for suppressive fire, mangonels, battering rams, and sophisticated approaches to undermining walls and cutting off water supplies. They also brought something Jani Beg had not counted on, something invisible, something that would change everything. Inside Caffa, the defenders were significantly outnumbered, but not without resources. The Genoese garrison at the time of the second siege likely numbered between 2,000 and 5,000 trained soldiers, a mix of professional Genoese military men, hired mercenaries, and armed civilian militias. Exact numbers are again uncertain, but what the defenders lacked in numbers, they compensated for in fortification. Caffa's walls were among the most formidable in the Black Sea region. The city sat on a natural harbor, which meant that one flank was relatively protected by water, and the Genoese maintained a small but capable fleet that could bring in supplies and reinforcements, and threaten the Mongol flanks from the sea. The walls themselves were thick stone, built and rebuilt over decades of commercial wealth, with towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire. The Genoese military of this period relied heavily on the crossbow, arguably the most powerful infantry-ranged weapon of the medieval world. Genoese crossbowmen were among the most sought-after mercenaries in Europe, and their ability to hold a wall against cavalry was well established. A crossbow bolt in this era could punch through chainmail at considerable range and from behind stone battlements. Crossbowmen had an enormous defensive advantage. The city also had its own artillery, counterweight trebuchets and mangonels positioned on the walls and towers, capable of striking back at Mongol siege positions and suppressing crews working the enemy's war machines. In addition to the garrison, Caffa's population included a large number of civilian refugees, merchants, traders, and their families, who had fled other Mongol-threatened areas and taken shelter behind its walls. This swelled the mouths to feed, complicated logistics, and would eventually become a critical vulnerability. We've talked about the armies, we've talked about the walls, but there's something Jani Beg brought to Caffa that no wall, no crossbow, and no amount of military genius could stop. Something that was already killing his own men by the thousands. Stay with me, because what comes next is where the story gets truly terrifying. Before we can understand what happened at Caffa, we need to talk about the disease, because the plague didn't start at Caffa. It arrived there. And tracing its origin takes us into one of the most fascinating and disturbing detective stories in all of epidemiological history. The Black Death was caused by Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. We know this with certainty now from ancient DNA analysis of mass burial sites. The disease manifests in several forms: bubonic plague, which causes the characteristic swollen lymph nodes called buboes; septicemic plague, which infects the bloodstream directly; and pneumonic plague, which attacks the lungs and can be transmitted person to person through respiratory droplets, arguably the most dangerous form. For centuries, historians debated where the Black Death originated. The answer appears to be Central Asia, the Tian Shan region, around modern-day Kyrgyzstan. A remarkable piece of evidence came from researchers studying gravestones in a Nestorian Christian cemetery at a site called Kara Jigach, dated to 1338 and 1339. Several of the inscriptions note that the deceased died of pestilence. Ancient DNA analysis of skeletons from the site, published in 2022, confirmed that these individuals died from Yersinia pestis, and specifically from a strain very close to the ancestral root of all four major lineages of Black Death that would subsequently spread across the world. So by 1338, a virulent strain of plague was already killing people in Central Asia. The question is, how did it get from Kyrgyzstan to the Black Sea coast in just 8 years? The answer is the same reason Caffa existed in the first place: the Silk Road. Plague moves along trade and military routes. Fleas carrying Yersinia pestis travel in the fur and grain sacks that merchants haul across the steppe. Infected rats establish themselves in the holds of ships and the caravans of merchants. The very networks of commerce and connection that made the medieval world rich became a superhighway for death. By 1345 and early 1346, the plague had reached the territory of the Golden Horde, and it was devastating them. The primary source we have for what happened at Caffa is a Genoese notary named Gabriele de Mussi, who wrote an account of the siege and its aftermath sometime around 1348 to 1349. De Mussi was not himself an eyewitness to the siege. He was writing in Piacenza, Italy, based on accounts from sailors and merchants who had survived and returned west. His account must be read with some scholarly caution, but it remains one of the most detailed and viscerally immediate contemporary descriptions of these events. De Mussi describes the Mongol besieging force as being struck by a sudden and overwhelming pestilence. The Tartars, fatigued by such a plague, he writes, and falling on all sides as if thunderstruck, and seeing that they were perishing hopelessly, ordered corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city of Caffa. So that by means of these intolerable passengers, the defenders died widely. Think about what this means from a military perspective. Jani Beg's army had been in the field for an extended period. Siege warfare in the medieval world was already brutal. Men lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions, ate poor food, drank contaminated water, and were exposed to all manner of infections that preyed on weakened immune systems. Add bubonic plague to that mix, and you have a catastrophe. Historians estimate that the plague may have been killing thousands of Mongol soldiers per day at the height of the outbreak in the camp. Officers died alongside common soldiers. Supply chains were disrupted. Morale, already strained by the grinding nature of a siege, collapsed in the face of an enemy that killed you in your sleep, in your own tent, far from any enemy blade. Jani Beg was watching his army melt away. He had not broken the walls of Caffa by force, and now he never would, not with a decimated, plague-ridden force. He faced a humiliating withdrawal. And that is when someone, we don't know who, had an idea. The use of disease as a weapon was not entirely new. There are accounts from antiquity of armies poisoning wells, hurling dead animals into water supplies, or deliberately placing diseased livestock in the path of enemy armies. But what happened at Caffa in 1346 is remarkable and almost uniquely documented as a deliberate, organized campaign of biological warfare. De Mussi is specific. The Mongols loaded the bodies of plague victims into their trebuchets and catapulted them into the city. The intention, whether it was fully understood in the modern epidemiological sense or not, was clear. If we are dying from this thing, then we will make them die from it too. There has been genuine scholarly debate about how effective this tactic actually was in spreading the disease. Yersinia pestis, in its bubonic form, is primarily spread by flea bites. The bacteria lives in the fleas that infest rats, and when the rat dies, the fleas jump to new hosts, Simply throwing a dead human body over a wall doesn't guarantee transmission because the body itself is not the vector. The fleas are. However, and this is important, bodies in an advanced state of decomposition could absolutely harbor pneumonic plague, which is transmitted through respiratory droplets. And there is another scenario that many historians find compelling, that the true mechanism of transmission was not the bodies themselves, but the rats. As plague devastated the Mongol camp, infected rats would naturally have migrated toward the nearest warm, food-rich environment, the walls and buildings of Caffa. The bodies hurled over the walls may have been more of a psychological weapon, a message from Jani Beg, "We are dying, and now so will you." While the real biological transmission happened through the rat and flea populations that had already been saturated with disease in the besieging camp. Whatever the precise mechanism, the result was the same. Caffa got plague. Here's a question for you to think about and drop in the comments. Do you think the Mongols fully understood what they were doing when they catapulted the bodies? Were they deliberately deploying a biological weapon, or were they acting out of desperation and grief, not really knowing what would follow? Let me know your take. We talk a lot about battles in history, the charge, the breakthrough, the glorious or catastrophic clash of arms. But for the people inside Caffa, the more relevant experience was not battle. It was waiting. And waiting in a medieval siege was a form of warfare in itself. A siege was fundamentally a contest of endurance. The besieger needed to prevent supplies from entering the city, prevent the garrison from sallying out, and eventually either starve the defenders into submission, undermine or breach the walls, or find some other way to force a surrender. The defender needed to hold on until relief arrived. The besieging army ran out of food or patience or disease, fittingly, given what we're discussing, thinned the enemy's ranks enough to change the balance. At Caffa, the defenders had several advantages. The harbor gave them access to the sea, and Genoese supply ships did bring in provisions at various points during the siege. This was one of the primary reasons Caffa didn't fall quickly. It was not as fully cut off as a purely landlocked city would have been. But supplying a city by sea, under threat of Mongol attack, was dangerous and expensive, and the flow of supplies was never guaranteed. The food situation inside Caffa during the extended siege would have been grim. Medieval siege rations were a study in gradual degradation. Initially, a well-provisioned city would draw on stored grain, dried legumes, salted fish and meat, wine and oil. These were the calories that kept armies and populations alive. But in a prolonged siege, these stores depleted. Fresh food, vegetables, fruit, disappeared quickly or rotted. Fresh water became a concern if cisterns ran low and external wells were outside the walls. The refugee population that had swelled Caffa's numbers meant there were more mouths than the city had planned for. Medieval cities had no concept of caloric tracking or nutritional science, but they understood very practically that grain stores were finite. Rationing would have begun early, and as the siege dragged on, portions would have shrunk. Malnutrition weakens the immune system. It makes wounds harder to heal and diseases easier to catch. The people of Caffa, before the plague arrived, were already being physically compromised by the slow grind of the siege. Then the bodies came over the walls. The bubonic plague, once it established itself inside Caffa, would have moved with terrifying speed through a population that was already stressed, malnourished, and crowded together. The disease had a brutal presentation. After an incubation period of 2 to 6 days, victims would develop sudden high fever, chills, and extreme fatigue. Then the buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes, most commonly in the groin, armpit, or neck, sometimes growing to the size of an apple. The skin around them would blacken as blood vessels burst under the surface. That's where the name Black Death comes from. Not from the sweeping mortality, but from the actual black, hemorrhagic bruising that covered the body. Without treatment, bubonic plague kills somewhere between 30 and 60% of those infected. Septicemic plague, when the bacteria enters the bloodstream directly, has a much higher mortality rate. Pneumonic plague, spread through the air, is close to 100% fatal without antibiotics. In a medieval city, there were no antibiotics. There was no concept of germ theory. Doctors, to the extent they existed, operated on a framework of humoral medicine, believing that disease was caused by imbalances of the four bodily humors. Treatments included bloodletting, which weakened patients further, aromatic herbs and fumigation, which had no effect on bacteria, and various herbal remedies that were at best useless and at worst actively harmful. People watched their family members swell and blacken and die in agony within days of the first symptoms. They watched their doctors die the same way. They watched priests die, the very men who were supposed to bring spiritual comfort. What do you do with the dead? Normally, medieval cities had extensive burial practices tied to the church, but when hundreds of people are dying per day, these rituals collapse, bodies pile up, mass graves are dug. Eventually, even the gravediggers die, and bodies begin to accumulate in the streets. This breakdown of funerary ritual was not just a logistical problem, it was a profound spiritual and psychological catastrophe. Medieval Europeans believed deeply that how you died determined what happened to your soul. The plague wasn't just killing people. In the minds of the survivors, it was potentially damning them. We've been talking about what it was like inside those walls, the hunger, the death, the despair. But here's what I want you to keep in the front of your mind. The people of Caffa weren't just victims. Some of them survived, and what those survivors did next would ensure that the nightmare of Caffa would follow them, all the way home to Italy, and then across all of Europe. We'll get to that. But first, let's talk about the commanders on both sides and the decisions they made in those final terrible weeks. Jani Beg, the Khan of the Golden Horde, is a complex historical figure. He is sometimes described by later Islamic chroniclers in relatively positive terms. He had converted to Islam and was seen as a reasonably just ruler. But at Caffa, he was a military commander, watching a campaign go catastrophically wrong. The Khan's decision to hurl corpses over the walls tells us something important about his state of mind. A commander with time and options doesn't resort to that kind of improvisation. Jani Beg knew his army was dying. He knew he probably couldn't storm the walls. He knew the Genoese fleet remained a threat to his flanks, and he knew that if he simply retreated without any result, it would look like a catastrophic defeat, politically dangerous for a Khan. So he weaponized his own dead. It was, in its brutal logic, a masterstroke of asymmetric warfare. He couldn't break the city with stone, so he would break it with plague. And then he would leave. But he would leave behind something that would follow the survivors wherever they went. On the Genoese side, the leadership of Caffa during the siege is less well documented. The city was governed by a consul appointed by the Republic of Genoa, and the garrison would have been under his command. What we can infer from the outcome is that the Genoese leadership made a rational, understandable, and ultimately catastrophic decision. When it became clear that the plague was inside the walls and killing the population, they ordered the evacuation of the city by sea. It was the right call militarily. Staying would have meant certain death, but the ships those refugees boarded were already carrying something invisible in their bilges, in their clothing, in the fleas on the rats that had nested in their cargo holds. Drop a comment if you were the Genoese consul of Caffa, knowing that plague was tearing through your city and through the Mongol camp. What would you do? Stay and try to hold out, negotiate, make a run for the sea? There's no good answer, but let's hear your strategies. By 1346, the siege of Caffa was effectively over. Not because the walls had fallen, not because the Genoese had surrendered, but because there were simply too few healthy men on either side to continue in the traditional sense. Jani Beg withdrew the remnants of his army back across the steppe. He would continue to rule the Golden Horde for another decade, and he would pursue other military campaigns, including a successful push into the Caucasus region. But the siege of Caffa was his greatest military embarrassment, and the plague had permanently weakened the Golden Horde. The loss of thousands of experienced warriors to disease at Caffa and in subsequent outbreaks would prove a major factor in the long-term decline of Mongol power on the western steppe. Jani Beg himself died in 1357, likely murdered by his son Berdi Beg, who seized the throne. Repeating grimly the exact fratricidal pattern by which Jani Beg had come to power himself. Back at Caffa, the surviving Genoese and other inhabitants were in a desperate state. The city had held. But at what cost? An unknown but significant portion of the population was dead or dying. The commercial networks that made Caffa wealthy had been severely disrupted, and the plague was now firmly established within the city walls. Here is where the story of Caffa becomes the story of the world. The Genoese ships that left Caffa in 1346 and the ones that followed in early 1347 were carrying survivors. They were carrying trade goods. They were carrying information about what had happened. And they were carrying plague. De Mussi describes the situation on board the ships in visceral terms. People who had seemed healthy when they departed began showing symptoms. The bodies piled up on deck. Sailors died at their oars. Ships arrived at their next port with most of their crew dead and the survivors staggering ashore, bringing with them the invisible passenger that had destroyed Caffa. The ship stopped first at Constantinople, the greatest city in the eastern Mediterranean. By 1347, plague was ravaging Constantinople. From there, it traveled to Sicily, arriving in October 1347 in the port of Messina, carried by Genoese trading ships. According to chronicler Michele da Piazza, people off those ships were already dying, carrying such virulence that anyone who spoke to them was seized by mortal illness. Messina authorities ordered the fleet to leave, but it was too late. The plague had come ashore with rats, fleas, and cargo. From Messina, it began its conquest of Europe. Within 2 years, the Black Death reached England and Portugal. By 1353, it swept through all of Europe, killing 25 to 50 million people. This was between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population. Some regions lost 60% or more of their inhabitants. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities that had taken centuries to build were reduced to ghost towns, all of it traceable in a direct epidemiological line back to the walls of Caffa. We'll discuss the death toll's meaning, how it reshaped European society, economics, religion, and politics. Let's pause and reflect. One city, one siege, one act of desperate, improvised biological warfare. 30 to 60 million people dead. That is the legacy of Caffa. Let's track the plague's path from Caffa to the rest of the world. The speed and scope of what happened is astonishing. Late 1346 to early 1347, Caffa, Crimea. The plague burned through the Genoese community and populations in contact with Mongol forces. 1347, Constantinople falls to plague. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened, is devastated. Emperor John VI Cantacuzénos loses his son. He writes a haunting first-hand account, one of the few from a political figure who witnessed it directly. October 1347, Messina, Sicily. The famous arrival of the Genoese fleet. Within weeks, the plague spread across the island and to the Italian mainland. November to December 1347, Sardinia, Corsica, Marseille. Genoese and Venetian trading networks became highways of death. Every port these ships touched became a new origin point. January to March 1348, Florence, Venice, Genoa. The great cities of the Italian Renaissance were absolutely devastated. Florence may have lost 60% of its population within months. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived, describes the city vividly. Bodies piled in streets, the living too few to bury the dead. Social bonds dissolved as people abandoned family members for fear of contagion. By mid-1348, the plague crossed the Alps into France, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula. By 1349, it reached England, Scandinavia, and the Baltic. By 1351, it had reached Russia. The world had seen plagues before, like Justinian's in the 6th century, but nothing matched the Black Death's speed, scope, and mortality. It killed more people, more quickly, than any event in human history before or since, including both world wars. What happened to Caffa itself? Caffa survived, remarkably. After the Mongol withdrawal, the Genoese gradually reasserted control. The city was rebuilt, restocked, and continued as a major trading center. The city would finally fall, not to Mongols or plague, but to the Ottoman Turks in 1475. Sultan Mehmed II sent a fleet under Gedik Ahmed Pasha. The Genoese defenders surrendered after a brief siege. The fall of Caffa ended centuries of Italian commercial dominance in the Black Sea, a last gasp of Genoese imperial expansion. Today, Feodosia is in Ukrainian Crimea, occupied by Russia since 2014. It is not famous. Few know what happened there in 1346, but the city that Gianni Beg's catapults unleashed plague upon is still there. The long-term consequences of the Black Death, set in motion at Caffa, are almost impossible to overstate. The plague didn't just kill people, it remade civilization. Economically, the death of a third to a half of Europe's population created a stunning labor shortage. Serfdom began to collapse. Dead serfs couldn't work, and survivors found bargaining power. They could demand higher wages, better conditions, or simply walk away. This economic disruption destabilized the feudal order. Lords and the church saw income collapse as labor costs rose. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 tried to freeze wages, but it was largely ignored. 2 decades later, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 shook the English ruling class. Similar dynamics played out across Europe. The Black Death was the beginning of the end of medieval feudalism. Religiously, the plague caused a crisis of faith, shaking the Catholic Church's authority. Priests and bishops died like everyone else. Pope Clement VI issued a bull clarifying Jews were not responsible. The bull was ignored, and pogroms swept Germany and France, killing tens of thousands of Jewish people. The flagellant movement, penitents whipping themselves to atone for sins, spread like a second epidemic. It was a symptom of mass psychological trauma and a challenge to the Church's monopoly. In the arts, the Black Death produced striking imagery, the danse macabre, or dance of death. Death came for everyone. Status, wealth, piety didn't matter. Medically, the plague created an urgent and productive crisis. Universities required systematic dissection to understand disease. A primitive form of quarantine, holding ships for 30 to 40 days, was invented by Venetian authorities in 1377. It was one of the first evidence-based public health interventions in European history. Demographically, Europe wouldn't recover its pre-plague population levels until the 16th century, 150 to 200 years later. A century and a half of lost people, lost productivity, lost creativity, lost potential. We're almost at the end, but Caffa's true extraordinary and modern aspect is its role as the first documented biological warfare. The question of what that means for how we think about war, disease, and state obligations is not medieval. It's our question too. Let's finish this. The use of plague-infected bodies as weapons at Caffa in 1346 is arguably the first well-documented biological warfare attack in history. The concept wasn't entirely new. Ancient armies poisoned wells, introduced diseased animals, and used plague victims' bodies to sicken populations. But Caffa is different. A detailed, near-contemporary account describes the deliberate, systematic deployment of a known infectious agent. This was against a population for the explicit purpose of killing them. That is the definition of biological warfare. Historical epidemiologist Mark Wheelis, in a 2002 paper, argued Caffa was the origin point of the Black Death pandemic in Europe. The biological warfare there, though imperfectly understood, had consequences dwarfing any conventional military operation. Consider the scale. Nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed 130,000 to 226,000 people. The Black Death, unleashed from Caffa, killed 25 to 50 million. No weapon in human history achieved anything close. It was achieved not by design, but by accident. Gianni Beg wasn't trying to kill half of Europe. He was trying to discourage the defenders of one trading post. This is what makes Caffa a genuinely modern story. The Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 exists because humans recognized biological weapons are uncontrollable. You cannot aim them. You cannot limit their damage to your enemies. What you unleash will come back to you. Gianni Beg's army carried plague back home across the steppe. The Golden Horde was devastated by the same disease it had weaponized. The Genoese sailors who fled Caffa spread it to every port they touched, including their own home city of Genoa. The Christians who persecuted Jews in Germany spread plague to themselves and their families. There is a profound, brutal lesson in the history of Caffa. In biological warfare, there are no winners. So let's bring it all back. In 1346, on a strip of coastline on the Crimean Peninsula, the Khan of the Golden Horde launched a siege. He brought an army of tens of thousands, disciplined cavalry, veteran siege engineers, the full weight of the most powerful steppe empire. The Genoese held behind their walls with their crossbowmen, harbour, and stubborn commercial pride. And then an invisible enemy arrived. It killed Mongols and Genoese alike. It didn't care about walls or catapults. It just killed. In an act of desperation, genius, or simple savagery, possibly all three, the Mongols turned their own dead into weapons and hurled them into the city they could not break by force. What followed was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. Tens of millions of people across 3 continents died in the years that followed. Civilizations were reshaped. The feudal order cracked and eventually broke. The church's authority was permanently damaged. The world that emerged from the Black Death, scarred, traumatized, rearranged, bore only a partial resemblance to the world that had existed before. All of it traceable to one siege, one desperate act, one city on the edge of the Black Sea that most people today cannot find on a map. Caffa. Remember that name, because it reminds us of something important. History doesn't always change in the places you expect. It doesn't always change on famous battlefields or in the capitals of great empires. Sometimes it changes in a trading post on a peninsula, when a Khan who's losing a siege makes one final furious decision. Sometimes the hinge of history is a catapult arm and a body and a gust of Black Sea wind. And now for my final question to you, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. If the Mongols had never besieged Caffa, or if the Genoese had never fled by sea, do you think the Black Death still reaches Europe? Or does it die out somewhere on the steppe, and Europe's history unfolds in an entirely different direction? What does a Europe without the Black Death look like? Drop your theories below. I read every comment. Thank you, genuinely from the bottom of my heart, for spending 2 hours with me on this story. History like this matters, not because it's dark, though it is, but because it teaches us something essential about how fragile civilization is, how interconnected we are, and how a single event in a forgotten corner of the world can ripple outward forever. If you found this valuable, please hit the like button. It helps this channel more than you know. And it helps this kind of deep historical content reach people who want to learn. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do it now. We do deep dives like this regularly, and I promise you won't regret it. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks again.